Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here in this very comfortable auditorium that we have here, I think. I just give a bit of a quick overview about process tracing as a method, what it is, and then I will give an overview also of the course that we will, or I will be teaching a course now in October. I've also taught a process tracing course 6 months ago during the ECPR winter school. And give you a first taste of what it is and what we are going to do. There we are. So, okay, process tracing. I love the method a lot, obviously. I actually encountered it for the first time during an ECPR winter school, I think it was at the time, years and years ago. And it's interesting because you need to do a lot of things. You need to be an expert on a subject. You need to know a lot about the case that you're investigating. You need to be very creative, especially in terms of the data, the empirical evidence that you use. There is also a lot of desk research involved, and also it's really an iterative process going back and forth between the article and that you're writing, or the paper that you're writing, and the research that you are doing. Sometimes you feel a bit like a detective if you're doing process tracing. That's always cool, as a political scientist, that you feel a bit like a police detective. And you're also a bit of a judge of your own work, and especially the evidence and the data that you use in order to support your causal claims. But I will come back to that in a minute. First, what is process tracing? If you compare it to a lot of other research methods, it might be a bit peculiar in the sense that most of other research methods, especially quantitative methods, but also a lot of qualitative methods, they look for patterns. They look for trends. They look for differences, similarities across cases, between cases, in order to come up with general theories and generalizable theories, right? Process tracing, in essence, is a single case method. It is most suitable, I think, for an in-depth assessment of a single case. There is a bit of discussion to what extent process tracing can also be used as a comparative method. There is some discussion and debate about that. But in essence, it is mostly a single case method. And it focuses on an inference, a causal relation within a specific case. And that is something that you're going to investigate very extensively. So not across case inferences, but within case inferences that you make. What you want to do is you want to explain a specific outcome, a political event, the outcome of a decision-making process, of specific bargaining, etc., etc. You can do a lot of things. And what you want to do, you want to explain this outcome by, as the name says it, studying the process leading up to this particular outcome. And what you're trying to do is you want to empirically verify the relation between a specific cause and a specific outcome. So you are going to look how this causal link, this causal relation, plays out in reality. So you want to open up the black box of causality between a specific cause and a specific outcome. And you're going to do that through a very, very detailed assessment. So again, shedding light on the process between cause and outcome. So that also means that it also has to do maybe more with how questions than with why questions, because you're also going to investigate how a specific cause leads to a specific outcome. What you do in statistical analysis, you look for particular trends, how often a particular cause and a particular outcome occur simultaneously, but that does not necessarily say a lot about how the cause and the outcome are connected to each other, and that is specifically what you're going to do with process tracing. See how a cause really leads to a specific outcome. How does it look like in practice? If you have already read a process tracing paper, this is what you often come across. These kind of boxes and arrows. That's how it looks like in practice. Now, there are different understandings, as with everything, I guess, among scholars, what process tracing as a methodology is or should be, ranging from more minimalist understandings of process tracing to more maximalist approaches. So as a bare minimum, a minimalist approach of process tracing, you could call this a bit of a narrative approach. This is a narrative, a structured narrative, a systematic narrative of a particular process that leads up to a specific event. This is often also chronological. This is often rather descriptive. What has happened and when has it happened? What is the sequence of these events? And how does a sequence of specific events leads to a specific outcome? Very, very empirically driven, and there's not really a focus on any underlying theory, or there's also not necessarily an attempt for theorization to come up with a generalizable theory. This is very, very case-specific, close to what you can call a kind of academic storytelling. A bit of in between a minimalist approach and a maximalist approach is a more pragmatic approach, a causal pathway approach, where you go beyond the mere description, where you also focus on specific links between a cause and a particular outcome. So you go already to a higher level of abstraction. You don't really stay with the very, very case-specific elements, as is the case with the narrative approach. You're also going to look for more abstract elements. But it's still a temporal process and not necessarily a theorization of a mechanism between X and Y. These are also sometimes called minimalist causal mechanisms. You look for elements that appear between a cause and an outcome, but you're not necessarily going to investigate how these different elements are connected to each other. But that is exactly what you're going to do with a causal mechanism approach. That's a maximalist approach. This is an example of such a causal pathway approach. So this is table or a figure from an article from this year from Koss, When and How Ideas Become Arguments. A causal mechanism, he calls it a causal mechanism. I'm not entirely sure that it's actually a causal mechanism, but he looks for the relation, the causal relationship between the disruption of a political competition and how this leads to a specific consensus on party funding. And what you see, you have these elements that are part of the causal story in a way, but if you read in the article, it does not necessarily go into how these different elements are interconnected. So this is a more pragmatic approach to process tracing. A maximalist approach really goes in depth in all these interlinking elements and components. How is the cause and the outcome connected? This is in practice operationalized as entities engaging in activities. Entities engaging in activities. And I will give an example in a minute. Right? So this is really a very, very detailed analysis of how the cause contributes to the outcome and all the interlinking parts as well. So you need to empirically verify all these different interlinking parts. An example, entities can be a lot of things. It can be politicians, it can be organizations, but it can also be concepts in a way. This is a causal mechanism to investigate how increased transparency in a decision-making process, that's the cause, leads to informalization as an outcome. So you see that increased transparency causes transaction costs. Entity engaging in activity, increased transparency causes transaction costs. These transaction costs trigger a coping mechanism that leads to informality. The informality becomes institutionalized, which leads to informalization. So it's quite clear how all these different components are linked together. I will come back to this in a minute. So if you want to engage in a process tracing analysis, there are two main steps. The first step is to come up with this kind of mechanism. And I now stay a bit with this maximalist approach. That's also the main focus of the course. And the first thing that you need to do is to come up with this kind of mechanism, these nice boxes and arrows. Of course, how do you do that? It can be top-down or bottom-up. Top-down is the theory-first approach, where you look in the literature for possible links between a cause and an outcome and a plausible interlinking process. And that is something that you want to translate into a specific mechanism. I'll give an example. Maybe I'll give an example now. This is something that I did myself. This is a causal mechanism of self-regulation, basically. And what I did is I wanted to investigate how the decision to engage in self-regulation or to use self-regulation as a regulatory approach leads to an outcome, a regulatory outcome, that deviates substantially from the objectives of, in this case, the European Commission. It was basically about the European Commission using self-regulation for social media platforms and how this has led to very negative policy outcomes. And what I did is I tried to translate principal-agent theory, that's a common theory, into a causal mechanism. So principal-agent, two main phases, politics of delegation, and then politics of discretion. So it's simply a translation of a theory that we know quite well into a causal mechanism. So the principal decides to use self-regulation as a regulatory instrument, which means he sets a number of objectives, but he leaves the actual implementation to the actors themselves. That's, of course, what self-regulation is. They come up with a self-regulatory framework that leaves a substantial degree of discretion to themselves, obviously. There are no really any monitoring instruments that have been implemented or sanctions that have been foreseen. So that means that when the agent deviates from the desired outcome, from these objectives, and there are no oversight mechanisms that can mitigate this, this leads to agency costs. This is, in a nutshell, an example of how a theory can be translated into a causal mechanism. Another way is bottom-up. Empirics first is that you know a case very well, and you come up with a very case-specific, empirically driven causal mechanism of what has happened. So you don't start from the literature, you start from your empirics, your data, your sources, and then you come up with a causal mechanism. This is something that I did for my PhD. This is a causal mechanism. It is a bit more complex of a particular regulatory change on party funding rules at the European level. But it's a bit more complicated than that. But it's just to give you an example of how you can also do it bottom up. Of course, that is something that you already know. In these kind of cases, you need a lot of case-specific knowledge. And you have that because you have all the sources, all the data that you've already gone through, and that allows you to construct this kind of causal mechanism. Right? So you need to be an expert on the topic, really, and that goes for all process tracing analyses. Step two, once you have this nice little causal mechanism developed, the next step is the empirical verification. Is this causal mechanism that you hypothesized also present in reality? Can you find empirical evidence to support this causal claim that you make? Right? This is the example that I gave before, the mechanism of how increased transparency leads to informalization. And then, as Evelien Koremans also did in her article, she looks for observable manifestations of all these different steps. She looks for observable manifestations, evidence, data, that can support her claim that increased transparency causes transaction costs, for example. The collection and evaluation of evidence, I think this is maybe the most interesting thing about process tracing. Why? Because it is a way to deal with your empirical material, with your sources, with your data, that you can also do even beyond process tracing as a method. It is a systematic and very critical assessment of the sources and data that you use. And it obliges you to think again, think critically about the sources that you use and the data that you use, and whether or not they are strong enough to support the causal claims that you make. That can be used in all types of qualitative research, basically. And the evaluation of evidence, you do it in two stages. First, the theoretical evaluation of evidence. And that's quite interesting. You don't even look at the evidence itself, but the theoretical evaluation happens first. So if you have, for example, this kind of step, increased transparency causes transaction costs, you first think about what kind of evidence could I find or should I find in order to support this, that I can really claim that this happened. What kind of evidence would I need? And that is something that Evelien Koremans also does in her article. She thinks, yeah, if this has really occurred in the case that I'm investigating, I should find, for example, references to transaction costs operationalized in a specific way, in interviews that I did with people that were part of the decision-making process, in documents from the EU institutions about this process. Transaction costs that could also manifest itself in more staff members that deal with transparency, for example. So you need to think about, okay, what could be possible empirical manifestations, what could be possible empirical evidence that I could encounter to support this particular claim, right? You do it step by step. You determine first the prior confidence in a causal claim. For example, is there any literature, any previous studies that we know that have dealt with this particular relation, how increased transparency causes transaction costs? If there have been already quite some studies, you have quite high prior confidence in this particular claim. And if you want to strengthen that confidence, you need very strong empirical evidence as well. If there is no previous research on this, also more modest empirical evidence is sufficient. So you determine the prior confidence, look for previous studies, you speculate on possible evidence that can be found. We just already discussed this. And then you evaluate the theoretical strength of the predicted evidence. Okay, if I find references in a document about transaction costs, how much will this increase my confidence in the causal claim that I make? We're still only at the theoretical level. If I find this, what would this mean for the causal claim that I make? Right? First step, theoretical evaluation. Then the empirical evaluation, you actually go look for these sources, this evidence. If you find it, is it convincing? Has it been very accurate? If you have these references to transaction costs in interviews, is it trustworthy? Who did you do the interview with? Was this person part of the decision-making process? Was he also part of the unit that was responsible for the decision-making process but was not participating himself or herself? These are all elements that you need to assess to see whether or not your empirical evidence is strong or weak. You do it for each of these pieces of evidence individually and then collectively. If you put everything together, how much confidence can you have in the causal claim that you make based on these sources, this data, this evidence that you put forward? Right. What often helps is to break down your causal claim into different components. Different components that are more easy or easier to assess empirically than the claim itself. This is an example from the research that I did myself. There is a particular box where I claim that national Eurosceptic parties, they have instrumentalized party organizations at the European level. Okay, that was my causal claim. And then I tried to break it up into different components. Okay, what does instrumentalization mean? Okay, it means that, and then I operationalize it, that they have a principled opposition against the establishment of European political parties, and these party organizations, they actually don't want to establish this. But despite this principled opposition, they do set up these European party organizations. They are set up with a specific aim, attract maximum EU funding, and the EU funding is not used to benefit or to strengthen the European party organization, but the national party organizations. It's a bit more complex, but in a nutshell, for the sake of an example, break this causal claim of instrumentalization into different components that are easier to verify empirically. Because, yeah, if you want to check if national Eurosceptic parties hold a principled opposition against European political parties, you can investigate debates, parliamentary debates, for example. You can look at press statements. You can look at party programs, for example, and then you can check it, right? And that makes it a bit easier than, instrumentalization. How do I assess this empirically? So breaking it down into different components often helps. What kind of evidence can you use? And here you need to be very creative. It can be basically anything. Anything that helps you strengthen or weaken your confidence in a particular causal claim, that can help, and you can use that in your process tracing analysis. Any empirical fingerprint, that is what it is often called in the process tracing literature. There are these kind of types of evidence that you can use: patterns, statistical patterns, sequence, related to temporal chronology. For example, sequence was important for my research. I used it to say, okay, these Eurosceptic parties set up European party organizations, but they only did it after the introduction of huge amounts of funding for European party organizations. This is kind of a sequence evidence. Trace evidence, the mere existence of something can also be evidence. The existence, in my case, of Eurosceptic Euro parties, that's a trace evidence, and that's also something that I used. Account evidence is the content of empirical material, the content of documents that you analyze, the content of interviews that you've done and transcribed, etc., etc. So all different types of evidence. But it's quite simple. You need to be very creative. Again, in some examples from my own research, I used some descriptive statistics about funding numbers and the income of European political parties, the evaluation of Eurosceptic MEPs to European political parties. I used internal documents of these parties. I even used pictures. This is an example of to prove, these Eurosceptic parties, they established these European party organizations, but these European party organizations were basically Potemkin parties. They only existed on paper, not in reality, because I went to their headquarters in Brussels, what was the registered headquarters of that European political party that appeared to be an apartment building with a hairdresser salon on the ground floor. So this is also something that I used as evidence, right? And this is when you feel a bit of a detective, an investigative journalist. That's a lot of fun to do this, right? So you can use whatever you want. So conclusions. What are the strengths of a process tracing method? It is empirically very rich because you use very thick descriptions. You have a lot of case-specific knowledge that you can use to support or not the causal claims that you make in the mechanism that you have developed. What I think is the biggest added value is this very rigorous evaluation of the data that you use. The theoretical evaluation, the empirical evaluation, and the method really forces you to critically look at the information, the data, the sources that you use through these different steps that you need to apply. It also gives you, it gives you the opportunity to give an extensive explanation of how a causal relationship works in practice, because you check in reality how causality manifests itself, how a causal relationship works. That's also one of the main strengths. Limitations, less suited for comparative research, already mentioned this. It is difficult to generalize beyond the case. So the claims that you make and the evidence that you find is very strong for the case that you investigate, but it's difficult to generalize this to other cases. Why? Because often very case-specific elements are an important part of the causal claims that you make and the evidence that you show. And that means that generalizing these findings to other cases, even very similar cases, is more difficult than with other methods. Right? And the last limitation or challenge, maybe, it is also a very time-intensive, time-consuming process. It's a very iterative process, going back and forth between the mechanism and the empirical material, investigating it, looking for it, critically assessing it. That takes a lot of time. So that means that if you have a PhD or a research project with multiple cases, you might be able to do a process tracing analysis on one or two cases, but probably not for all the cases under investigation. But it could be a part of a broader mixed method approach, for example. And that I think process tracing is very well suited for. So how would the course look like? It's a 5-day course. First day is about the foundations of process tracing methodology. We also go a bit into more ontological and epistemological questions. What is process tracing as a method? What are the different approaches? We already discussed this shortly in the presentation today. Second day is dedicated to the causal mechanism. What is a causal mechanism? How do you construct it, etc., etc. Day 3 is about the collection and evaluation of evidence, theoretical evaluation, empirical evaluation. Day 4 is about case selection, so which cases are suited for a process tracing analysis. If you have a large population of cases, which of the cases should you pick? And day 5 is process tracing in practice. That is some of the newest or the most recent developments in the process tracing literature. But I would also like to give you the opportunity to present your own work, and then you get direct feedback on whether or not process tracing is a suitable method for your own research project, and how it can be improved, yes or no. Voila, that's it. I'm open to any questions, but I thank you already for your attention. Thank you.